Come, let's do what Mommy and Daddy usually do at night. You know, when the lights are low and the music's right. Did you really want to know how it feels? When the love is real and the moment's sealed? And Mommy will be shouting, I love you more. Come, let's do it together. But don't shout so that Mommy will hear us.
The night was dark and cold, with rain falling gently on the zinc roof. The soft pitter-patter of raindrops created a rhythm that filled the air. Water trickled through the holes, forming small puddles on the cracked cement floor. David had placed a small plastic bowl under one of the leaks, but the bowl was already full, and the water had begun to spill over the edges. The room smelled of dampness and old clothes. It was small, with only one window that barely let in any air. The shutters were broken, and the wind whistled through the cracks. The only furniture was an old mattress pushed into the corner, covered with a faded wrapper that had long lost its original colors. A single kerosene lantern flickered weakly in the corner, casting long shadows that danced across the stained walls. This was where David and Eno, brother and sister, slept every night. David was 13 years old, tall for his age, with eyes that always seemed lost in thought. His shoulders were broader than most boys his age, thanks to the chores he had to do. Eno was 11, small and skinny, with a soft, quiet voice that often got lost in the noise of their home. She had a head full of wild, curly hair that their mother never had time to braid properly. The room was supposed to be a place of rest, but for them, it felt more like a prison. Their parents, Emeka and Abigail, were always busy or arguing. Their father spent most of his time drinking at the bar, while their mother sold food at the market from morning till night. When they came home, they either argued loudly or ignored each other completely. The children had grown used to the shouting and silence. They had learned to tiptoe around their parents' moods, afraid of getting caught in their fights. David often wondered how life had gotten this way. He remembered when their family was happier, back when their father had a steady job and their mother laughed more. But those memories felt like stories from another life, distant and unreal. Now, their house was filled with tension so thick that even the walls seemed to carry the weight of it. The rain outside grew heavier, and the sound of it hitting the roof made it hard to sleep. Eno curled up on the mattress, pulling the thin wrapper over her head. David lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. His mind was restless. He often thought about how different their lives could be if their parents were different, if their home was different. He thought about the homes he had seen when he passed the big houses on his way to school. The ones with iron gates and curtains that looked clean and bright. He imagined what it would be like to live in a house like that, to sleep in a bed with soft pillows and a proper blanket. He imagined waking up to the smell of breakfast instead of the sour smell of wet clothes. David sighed and turned on his side. The room was too small for two growing children to share, but they had no choice. They had always shared this room, as far back as he could remember. There was no privacy. They ate, slept, did homework, and changed clothes in the same small space. Sometimes, David wished he had a room of his own, a place where he could think without feeling trapped. Eno stood beside him and whispered, "David, are you still awake?" "Yes," he replied softly. "Why do they always fight?" she asked. It wasn't the first time she had asked that question, and David never knew how to answer. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe they're tired." Eno was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "Do you think they'll ever stop?" David didn't answer. He didn't want to lie to her. Instead, he reached out and patted her shoulder. "Go to sleep, Eno." She nodded and closed her eyes, but David stayed awake. His thoughts drifted to the things he had seen, the things children should never see. His parents' constant arguments would often turn into something else, something strange and confusing. They never closed their bedroom door properly, and David and Eno had seen things they didn't understand. He hated those nights. Eno would hum to herself to drown out the noise, but David couldn't block it out. He felt angry, ashamed, and helpless all at once. At school, his classmates would joke about things like that, but for David, it wasn't funny. It was real, and it made him feel trapped in a world he didn't understand. The rain began to ease, and the sound of frogs croaking filled the night air. David turned to look at Eno again. She was fast asleep now, her face peaceful. He envied her ability to escape into sleep so easily. He wished he could do the same, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He thought about what life would be like if they had a better home. Maybe their parents would smile more. Maybe they would have family meals and laugh together like the families he read about in his school books. Maybe they wouldn't have to sleep in a damp room that smelled like old water and kerosene. David closed his eyes and tried to picture a better life, but the images always faded too quickly. The reality of the small, damp room always pulled him back. The weight of it pressed down on him, like an invisible burden he couldn't escape. The night passed slowly. The rain stopped, but the chill remained. And even in his dreams, the room stayed with him, his prison disguised as home. The next day was quiet. The rain had stopped, and the sun cast a pale light over the compound. The air was still damp, and tiny droplets of water clung to the leaves outside the window. David and Eno went about their morning routine, washing their faces, sweeping the floor, and tidying up the little space they called home. Their mother, Abigail, had already left for the market, and their father, Emeka, was nowhere to be found. The house was eerily silent, but David preferred it that way. Silence was better than the sound of fighting. He and Eno moved around carefully, as if they were afraid of waking up the walls. They didn't talk much, except for the occasional whisper. By evening, Abigail returned with a tired expression and a few food items in a plastic bag. She looked at her children briefly, muttered something about cooking later, and disappeared into the bedroom. As night fell, the familiar sound of the neighbors' televisions and laughter filled the compound. Eno sat on the mattress, brushing her hair with a small plastic comb while David read an old, torn book from school. The pages were worn, but reading helped him escape the world around him. Just as David was beginning to lose himself in the story, they heard the front door creak open. Emeka had returned. The strong smell of alcohol followed him into the house. He muttered something under his breath and stumbled past the children without looking at them. David's heart sank. He knew what was coming. Within minutes, the muffled sound of his parents' voices drifted from the bedroom. It started with low murmurs, then grew louder. The argument was about money, again. Abigail's voice was sharp and bitter, while Emeka's words were slurred and defensive. Eno pulled the wrapper over her head and whispered, "I hate when they do this." David nodded, unable to respond. He closed the book and leaned back against the wall, listening to the familiar cycle of anger and accusations. Then, suddenly, the shouting stopped. David frowned. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the argument. He heard the bed creak, followed by strange sounds that made his stomach twist. He looked at Eno, who had removed the wrapper from her face and was staring at him with wide, confused eyes. "David," she whispered. David felt frozen. His mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. The noises from their parents' room grew louder, soft giggles, hushed whispers, and the rhythmic creaking of the bed. David felt heat rise to his face. He turned away from Eno and stared at the wall, trying to block out the sounds. But no matter how hard he tried, they seeped into his mind, filling him with a strange mixture of confusion, anger, and shame. Eno's small voice broke the silence again. "What are they doing?" David clenched his fist, feeling helpless. "I don't know," he muttered. Just close your eyes. Ino lay down, pulling the wrapper tightly around herself like a cocoon. David lay down too, but sleep felt impossible. The sounds from the other room felt louder than ever, echoing in his ears and carving themselves into his memory. When David opened his eyes the next morning, the house was quiet again. His parents' door was shut, and the mattress beside him was empty. Ino had woken up before him and was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked distant. David sat up and rubbed his eyes. Ino, are you okay? She shook her head slowly. I had a bad dream, she whispered. David knew it wasn't a dream. It's okay, he said, even though he didn't believe it himself. He walked over and sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. We'll be okay. Ino looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Why do they act like that? David didn't have an answer. He felt the same questions burning inside him, but there were no words that could explain it. Instead, he hugged his sister tightly, hoping that somehow, his silence would be enough to comfort her. The things they had seen and heard were things children should never have to witness. Yet, they carried those moments with them like invisible scars, scars that would take a long time to heal. The night was unusually quiet. The frogs that usually croaked loudly after the rain had fallen silent, and the compound seemed still. The air inside the room was heavy, and the weak light of the lantern flickered as if it, too, was tired of burning. David lay awake, staring at the ceiling again. The images from the night before played over and over in his mind, the strange sounds, the way his father had laughed softly, and the way his mother's voice changed. It had all seemed so different from the usual fights. Beside him, Ino was curled up with her eyes closed, but her breathing was uneven. David knew she wasn't really asleep. She hadn't been the same all day, quiet, distant, and avoiding eye contact. Ino, David whispered. She didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes and turned to face him. David hesitated, his heart thumping in his chest. He didn't know why he was thinking this way, but the thoughts were there, like an itch that wouldn't go away. Do you ever wonder why they do that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ino's eyes widened. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She knew. I don't know, she said softly. Maybe it makes them happy. David stared at her, thinking. Do you want to know what it feels like? Ino's face scrunched in confusion. What do you mean? David shifted closer and lowered his voice even more. Come, let's do what Daddy and Mommy usually do at night. Ino stared at him for a long time. The lantern flickered, casting shadows across her face. She didn't speak, but her small nod was enough. The silence between them grew thick as they gave in to their confusion and curiosity. The next morning, the first light of dawn streamed through the broken window. The birds outside chirped softly, welcoming a new day. David woke up first. He blinked slowly, unsure if the events of the night before had been real or just a strange dream. But when he turned to Ino, who was still curled up next to him, he knew it wasn't a dream. She opened her eyes and smiled at him, a small, innocent smile that made his chest feel warm and heavy at the same time. Good morning, she whispered. Good morning, David replied. For the first time in a long while, the room felt different, lighter, almost peaceful. The sounds of their parents arguing in the next room didn't seem to reach them. But as the minutes passed, something else settled in David's heart, something he couldn't name but knew wasn't right. He felt Ino's small hand resting near his and wondered if they had crossed a line they didn't understand. The warmth of her smile began to feel like a weight. Ino sat up and stretched, still smiling. I feel happy, she said quietly. Do you? David hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he whispered, though deep down, there was a part of him that felt something different, something he couldn't explain. As they went about their morning routine, sweeping the floor and getting ready for the day, David kept stealing glances at Ino. She seemed lighter, like she'd found something to hold on to in a world that had always felt cold. But David's heart felt heavy, as though something precious had been misplaced. Sometimes, children are forced to grow up too fast. In the absence of guidance and love, they seek answers in the wrong places. That morning, David and Ino were happy, but it wasn't the kind of happiness that could last. They didn't yet understand the weight of their choices, but life would soon teach them what it meant to carry the burden of innocence lost too soon.